to discover that Gary Cooper killing the Indians, when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, to which you owe your life, your identity, has not, in its whole system of reality, involved any place for you. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those were the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. James Baldwin was an amazing novelist, playwright, activist. He was a gay man. He was brilliant. He was agitated. He was gifted. He was angry. He was one of the greatest voices in the 20th century. He ended the debate with Buckley with these words. He said, "It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it." I was born the same year James Baldwin said those words. My mother, Sandra, was one of 11 children to Thomas and Loretta Weston. On the front cover of the program, there's a picture of these kids sitting on the stairs. That was in the early 40s. It was literally a minute and a half around the corner on DuBois Street. It's something to consider about how important family was back then. Carrie Wisiger Majors was my great-grandmother. We knew her as Mama. She was the force to be reckoned with in our family. Strong matriarch. She gave birth to 3 girls, Loretta, Alice, and Beatrice. Alice had 3 girls, and they're pictured in that same picture, because we raised children collectively. That was what we did. Beatrice moved to New York. Alice and Loretta moved off Van Zandt Avenue. My grandmother Loretta, she had a house on the corner of Hall and Sheffield Street, right near Epley Laboratory. And my aunt Alice was on Halsey Street. Mama, well, she bought a house on Warner Place, just minutes away, because you kept everything in that family. In the early 60s, my mother met a Marine stationed here in Newport. His name was Rodney Davis. He was from Philadelphia. They married, yet not much is spoken about that marriage. I do have a picture out of it on my Facebook page, but that's basically not a whole lot of information. Their courtship details were very vague. I know they met at a nightclub on West Broadway, now known as Wheatland Boulevard, and that's it. No more details, no stories. I did hear one story once, though, of an instance where their landlord on K Street, Mrs. Sarah Penner, you might remember she used to work in the guidance office at Rogers High School. She came upstairs with a bat, a baseball bat, and said, "Enough." I would get tidbits of stories, but by the time I was born, he was gone. He went back to Philadelphia, and I always remember hearing my mother talk about being there with a brand new infant, me, watching the first airing on CBS of A Charlie Brown Christmas with her father. We lived on Evart Street, 102 Evart, which is right around the corner, again, in the village. And though I was too young to remember any of those details, when I still hear Christmas is here, or Christmas time is here, it's a little melancholy. The family, as families do, and especially here in Newport, we got to leave. Yeah. And generations and people were building careers and raising families. And it's amazing, from that period of time, in 5 years, the marriage between my grandfather and my grandmother was done. My grandmother, soon after, at age 55, died of gangrene because her appendix had burst, and she continued to work to provide for her family. But not much is spoken, not much is said. Come to think about it, there really wasn't many stories, no history. I recently took my DNA and did the ancestry DNA. I wasn't surprised with the results, but I was disappointed that, again, I don't know. Who am I? Yes, I know that I'm 73% based out of the West African continent. The rest? England, Ireland, Northwestern Europe, France, Spain. See, this is significant. Our stories are necessary to understand our history. I knew nothing of my ancestors, nothing. I didn't learn about African history at school. For hundreds of years, people of African descent relied on storytelling to chronicle our histories, because as slaves, we did not read, nor did we write. When they were emancipated, they were definitely not given tools for advancement. In fact, laws were created to hold them back. How did they learn? How did they learn the Bible? They sang about it. That call and response, that's how they learned. The church was their school. In time, they would definitely build schools and colleges and universities, but it wouldn't be easy. Slavery might have been abolished, but racism, classism, and hate had soaked into the fabric of America like black crude oil on a crisp, laundered white shirt, and there was no solution to get it out. There is something insidious about racism. It plays the long game. It just doesn't think about today. It thinks about yesterday and tomorrow and beyond. When I think of the lost cause belief, whose very teachings perpetuated that slavery was a benign institution, slavery was good for the slaves, whose lives would have been so much worse if they stayed in Africa. Forget about racism, forget about barbaric working conditions, forget about economic greed, brutality, physical, mental, sexual abuse, humiliation, stripping away the dignity of a human being. It wasn't that bad, was it? That long game had some players. One we see frequently, but you don't hear the name. You hear a lot about statues and monuments. Enter the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, they didn't come up with the teaching of the lost cause, but they knew the long game is you have to influence what people think about it. So in the early part of the first decades of the 20th century, they did something that was tactically was brilliant. Disgusting, but brilliant. So they said, how do we can preserve the belief that all these things that the Civil War is being said is right? Let's put monuments up. Put them up everywhere. Spent millions of dollars doing it to establish a false narrative. Then they did something even better. They had textbooks written to be not just taught in Southern schools, but all over the country. This false narrative. Their website, as of this year, had this quote. I got to read this to you. Slaves, for the most part, were faithful and devoted. Most slaves usually were ready and willing to serve their masters. Education is still one of the most important battlegrounds for the advancement of people of color on issues of immigration, for gender and women's issues, for LGBTQ issues, education. And it's funny, coming down here, watching Channel 10, what is happening in Maine? They're having a law that's being drafted to sort of restrict what is being taught. Now, I understand where things can get inappropriate, but part of the discussion and part of our learning is to understand difference and not to be afraid of it. I never heard of the 1921 Tulsa massacre. Have many of you? I sat in my car one day outside of Best Buy, listening to NPR. Yes, I know, NPR. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here, a black man was just hearing for the first time that an action took place in May 31st of 1921 and lasted all the way to June 1st, where mobs of white folks attacked black residences and businesses in Greenpoint, which is part of Tulsa. It was considered, and is still considered, the worst incidents of racial violence in the United States of America. The attack carried out was not only on the ground, but they even dropped incendiaries from the air. 35 blocks of a community was leveled, burnt, destroyed. Schools, churches, hospitals, businesses, gone, wiped off the face of the earth. It was considered at that time the wealthiest black community in the country. They used to call it the Negro Wall Street. Black and white residents were like so shocked by that people didn't talk about it. Black folks were saying, can't forget about this. Yeah. You get that uncomfortable feeling. You don't want to talk about it. We all do it. No, we don't want to talk about it. There was silence for decades. It was only into recent years that they have actually formed a center and a commission through the government to be able to address that issue. And I had the privilege of going there with one of my students from the Tulsa Met School and was absolutely blown away by the historical account that took place. 3 years later, in 1924, you had the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia. Now that's something. We want to make sure that we don't mix up people. They wanted to make sure you were recorded at birth if you were colored or white. Only two choices. If you're either one or the other. They even came up with a one-drop rule, meaning if you had one drop of black blood, you could not be white. Native Americans, sorry, you're colored. You're in that category. It's interesting, marriage might have been prohibited, but nature and love always prevails. My family is from Culpeper, Virginia, and look at me. They didn't want this. It's important that I get to know my history, because in some small way, we were part of it. My story, your story, our history. I know this is Black History Month, and there's so much information just walking through the streets of Newport about Black history. But again, who is telling our story? Who is telling our truth? Interestingly, last night I got a call from my cousin Carol, one of the young girls who was sitting on the stoop over on DuBois Street. At 3 o'clock this afternoon at Redwood Library, she's going to be singing and participating in a Black History event. She's in her 80s, but still finds it important to teach, and to teach by song. It's a challenge sometimes for me when I talk about Black history because I still sometimes feel to this day lesser than. I still sometimes feel without worth, without value, because sometimes I unknowingly embrace a narrative that has already been written for me. For example, I went to Rogers High School. I loved Rogers. When I graduated, I cried. But yet, while I was in Rogers, I did learn a career that I still do today. But not once was I ever encouraged to go to college, to apply for university. I was told, get a good job. You can't afford that. That was wrong. Every student at the Met School is encouraged to apply for college. You don't have to go, but it's important to learn. Important to be engaged. It's important to have dreams. I remember being young, growing up off Kingston Avenue, being called a nigger because I was just too black. I also remember being called an Oreo because I didn't speak slang and I didn't act black enough. Baldwin wrote, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." But we have come to understand that history, my story, your story, is not fixed. It can be and it must be changed, even if we are not the beneficiaries of that work, of that fruitage. Now, I want you to listen to, I have two clips I want you to listen to. I want you to see what these interesting words are describing and how that narrative is still the same today. Now let's see if this technology is going to work. Did you hear the similarities? Gender identity, economic equality and equity, racial privilege, singing "Those Were the Days When America Was Great." Black folks singing about good times, even though their life was miserable. There was nothing joyous about what they were singing about, but yet, just like their spirituals, they sang about going to heaven because that was the best option that they had. Norman Lear, a white Jewish man from New Haven, Connecticut, heard about this program in England called Till Death Do Us Part and said, "Oh my God, that's just like the relationship with my father." And the rest was history. All in the Family, one of the most influential TV shows that was ever created. He created Good Times, The Jeffersons, Maude, One Day at a Time, describing the life of a single mother raising children. Even today, they redid One Day at a Time and then took a twist and made it about a Latina family. You see, he did something. He addressed issues even when it was uncomfortable, but not just one side. Archie Bunker had his voice because it did speak to a people. It spoke to a population that existed at that time that was real, but it changed the conversation. It brought real issues into millions of homes. You see, that's the big picture. The conversations, the stories, the testifying, the witnessing, the tweets, the posts, the snaps. This is our modern emancipation, the fact or the process of being set free, liberation, being freed from slavery. The other day I was on Facebook and read, you have ever heard of the Red Table Talk with Jada Pinkett Smith? Her mom, Adrienne, said something that just knocked me off my seat. She says, "People cannot beat you up with your own truth." I was like, whoa, got to write that one down. That's going in the sermon. People cannot beat you up with your own truth. Telling our stories, listening to other stories, learning about others who may not look like us, who might not dance like us, speak like us, is powerful. It's our truth. It's our history. It's something we should do not one day, not just 1 month, but year-round. When I think of what my ancestors went through in this very city, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that they loved me, though they never knew me. I can still, in my mind, hear the church mother citing 1 John 4:8, God is love. And I sort of like, how is God love when we went through all this? You know what? They loved their new God. They loved their family. They loved their community. And in a strange way, I understand, because if God is love, then love is God. And each and every one of us can occupy that space in the divine if we love. In the Christian faith, there is no greater commandment than to love God and to love your neighbor. And that's hard, especially when those Christians hate you. Your very existence as a black gay man is challenging for them in this world we live in that is filled with hate. It reminds me of another scripture that the Apostle Paul said in Galatians chapter 6. He says, "So let us not get tired in doing what is good, for in due season, in due time, we will reap a harvest of blessings if we do not give up." My story continues. My mother is almost 80, and unfortunately, she suffers from dementia. She is now a resident on Harrison Avenue at Village House. Though her present memory is foggy, she still has lots of stories, and I want to hear them. My father, to whom I've only met once for 2 hours when crossing from LA to Philadelphia, has called me. He had a health scare. He had the tip of his pancreas taken off because it had cancerous cells. And his wife, who I do communicate, says, your father wants to see you. So next month, I have to go down there and talk with him. I'm going to have to bring a lot of love. A lot of love. I'm not sure what to make of it, but in the back of my head, I hear the church moms, the Medeas, singing this song, which I'm going to end with you today, because it's very important that we do this. It wasn't a spiritual, but you get a bunch of people together, they can make any song spiritual. And the song went like this. Walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky, and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the storm, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on, walk on, with a hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You never walk alone. Walk on. Thank you.